Okay, everyone, welcome back. We would like to resume the proceedings by focusing on a particularly vexing issue in armed conflict, which is the use of human shields. We have two wonderful panelists who will be discussing that. First will be Professor Claire Finkelstein from the University of Pennsylvania. She's a Biddle Professor of Law and Philosophy at Penn. She's also the founder and director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which does absolutely terrific work and has done for many years. I've had the privilege of being involved in some of that. And our second panelist is Michael Walzer, and I could probably just stop there. But he's Professor Emeritus at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, probably best known to people here for his sort of reformulation, modern formulation of just war theory in his book, Just and Unjust Wars. So we will have Claire first, and then Michael will be joining us remotely.
Thank you so much, Mitt, and thanks to the Stockdale Ethics Center, to Ed Barrett, and it's a great honor to be on a panel with Michael Walzer. Michael, we have never met formally, but I have taught your work every single year for the last 15 years to my students, and written about it probably every year for the last 15 years as well. So it's a great honor to be on a panel with Michael Walzer. So I'm going to speak about one of the most difficult problems in contemporary armed conflict today from the standpoint of in bello analysis, and that is the problem of human shielding. This is a problem both from the standpoint of theory, that is, it's a deep theoretical problem, and from the standpoint of practice in theater, in international diplomacy, and in the information space. So let's assume that the following situation obtains. Assume a country is fighting a war of self-defense from the standpoint of ad bellum analysis. This is not an important feature in truth because our analysis here is on the in bello side, but it helps to describe the conundrum and to make it a little more pointed. And let's also make the assumption that the self-defending nation wishes to do everything it can to exercise that ad bellum right consistent with the law of armed conflict in theater. Then the following situation may obtain. The enemy, and if we could, is there, thank you. There we go. The following situation may obtain. The enemy may use human shielding for the particular purpose of exploiting the self-defender's adherence to LOAC, such that the self-defender may be constrained in what it can do to fight that war of self-defense. This occurs through the manipulation of the rules of proportionality and distinction. Since the use of the civilian population may be entirely at the disposal of the enemy, fighting an enemy that is willing to use its own civilians in this way can create a profound asymmetry in the law of war, such that that self-defender cannot prosecute the war without killing massive numbers of civilians. This, in turn, may have serious consequences for the course of the conflict along multiple dimensions. First, it may be the case that the war cannot be fought without catastrophic consequences for exposing civilians to injury and death, as well as the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Two, there may be manipulation of the information environment, such that the self-defender cannot prosecute the war without being perceived as the aggressor. Third, there may be a lack of accounting for who is responsible for civilian casualties. And fourth, there is the potential for confusion in the rules of engagement and difficulty assessing best practices for protecting civilians against harm. Now, while what I am describing will bear an obvious, for some, resemblance to the circumstances in the war in Gaza, I do not wish to delve too deeply into whether that actual war does or does not instantiate the situation I am describing in the first instance, though I will make some remarks in a bit about some aspects of the conflict in Gaza with regard to human shielding. But the phenomenon of human shielding has been faced by US troops in many situations. It is a tried and true technique of terrorists in urban combat. It was used by ISIS in Mosul, by Libyan, Serbian, and Iraqi forces against US troops. It goes as far back as Vietnam, being used by the Viet Cong, and thus the problem is worthy of study and must be addressed outside of the context of the present war in Gaza. So what is human shielding as used in war? It is when one side in the conflict deliberately interposes civilians between itself and the other side in order to dissuade or prevent that side from using force in an armed conflict. It is the exploitation in particular, let's see if this pointer works, no, of the rules of,
Back here.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay. No, so I was trying to point to the board, but I think that the pointer maybe doesn't work. It is the rules of the exploitation of the rules of in bello morality with regard to proportionality and distinction. So let's assume, once again, and again, this is an assumption not meant to comment on any actual conflict, that on the ad bellum side, we have a situation in which one side in the conflict is fighting a war of self-defense, and in the in bello side, we have a situation in which that self-defender is attempting to adhere to the rules of military necessity, proportionality, and distinction. Okay. I'm supposed to advance. Okay. So from the standpoint of those principles, when military operations foreseeably kill or injure civilians, the anticipated injuries must be proportionate to the value of the intended military targets. But what happens when the civilians are placed there intentionally by the enemy to exploit the laws of war? What happens when they are interposed in between the enemy and the self-defender? What then is the rule with regard to the protection of civilians? Okay. Well, first, it bears emphasizing, and this must be stated very clearly, that under multiple aspects of the laws of armed conflict, it is prohibited to use human shields. The International Red Cross is very clear that customary international law, Rule 97, forbids the use of human shields. In the context of international armed conflicts, the rule is also set forth in the Third Geneva Convention with respect to prisoners of war, the Fourth Geneva Convention with respect to protected civilians, and Additional Protocol 1 with respect to civilians in general. Under the statute of the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, quote, utilizing the presence of a civilian or other protected person to render certain points, areas, or military forces immune from military operations constitutes a war crime in international conflicts. Okay. So we should have no doubt about the impermissibility of the use of human shields. There are 4 questions that we might focus on in asking about the nature of human shielding. First, do civilians who are used as human shields lose their protection under the law of war? Second, how does one identify the category of human shielding, and how does one know when one is dealing with human shields? 3, is there a difference between voluntary and involuntary human shields? And 4, is it possible for one side to completely disable the other side's lawful military operations through the use of human shields? Okay, so I'm going to address these questions in turn. So first of all, do civilians who are human shields lose their protection? under the law of war? And emphatically, the answer is no. Okay, so philosophers, thought experiment, babies strapped to the front of a tank, and you are in combat and you are about to lob a grenade at that tank when you notice there is, excuse the stylized graphics. I searched the internet, I could not find any picture of an actual baby strapped to a tank. So, believe it or not, there's a fair bit of philosophical writing with this lurid hypothetical. Is it permissible for you to throw the grenade? Well, in civil law, of course, the answer is yes. If you are a self-defender, the proportionality requirement in civil law, self-defense, has to do with the aggressor, not the human shields that may be interposed between you and the aggressor. But the law of armed conflict here is different. In the law of armed conflict, and we're not talking about the personal self-defense rights of the combatant who is dealing with the attack in armed conflict. We're talking about the law of armed conflict, and so national self-defense, and we're talking about in bello morality. And so in that context, there is a duty to consider the civilian harm of the human shield that will be inflicted if one is to lob the grenade at the tank. That is a question of proportionality. Though the enemy has, in this case, strapped the baby to the front of the tank and is responsible for this setup, nevertheless, you have the obligation to weigh the proportionality of the civilian harm. Now, the problem is that perhaps in this situation, you may say, okay, the harm is proportional, you may proceed. The enemy has the ability, of course, to multiply that situation such that, they can affect the weighting of the proportionality analysis. And imagine, therefore, that it's possible for the enemy, and it's not necessary for us to ask the question at what point the attack becomes disproportionate, but we assume that there is some point at which the attack on the tank would become disproportionate because, once again, you have a duty to weigh the proportionality of the attack with regard to lobbing that grenade. That fact, the analysis of the proportionality, lies entirely in the hands of the enemy. And that is a horrendous problem. That is the conundrum of human shielding, which is that the enemy can render your own operations disproportionate by intentionally using human shields to disable your operations. Okay, so now the question is, and this will be our fourth question, but looking ahead, if it's possible for the enemy to do that, is it possible for the enemy to do this so thoroughly that, in effect, you cannot prosecute the war? In dense urban conflict, if you are fighting an enemy that does not care about the civilian population and is intent, indeed, and may gain benefit from harm brought to its own civilian population, is it possible that you may be fighting an enemy that seeks to increase to a vast degree the amount of civilian harm and will attempt to do this by making you responsible for it and thereby gaining by, number one, disabling your operations to the extent that they can count on your fidelity to in bello morality. Number two, scoring in the information environment by making you into the aggressor and making you responsible for large amounts of civilian casualties. And three, casting confusion over responsibility for civilian harm and amounts of civilian damage in a conflict. And I think the answer is yes, it is possible for this to occur. And so this poses a deep theoretical and practical problem, right? How does one deal with this in the law of war? This has not been sufficiently dealt with. While it is clear that the use of human shields is illegal and impermissible and a war crime, there's been extremely little condemnation of this war crime. There's been extremely little focus on this war crime. And there's been extremely little analysis of how to integrate our understanding of this war crime with the rest of imbello morality and how it should play out in a complex urban conflict. Okay. So now to discuss the situation in Gaza, and again, it's a deeply complicated situation with many factors, but just to isolate this particular factor, and to address the question of what is, the second question that I posed, what is human shielding and how do you know if you are dealing with it? Well, there is an argument to be made that the 450 miles of tunnel that exists underneath Gaza is a complex human shielding situation. We have a situation in which we have tunnels that have primarily served as a safe harbor for Hamas underneath Gaza. We have a dense civilian urban population up above these tunnels, and we have a war taking place largely through aerial bombardments as well as ground troops, of course, up above the surface. And the difficulty is that those miles and miles of tunnel run underneath that civilian infrastructure. Those civilians are trapped in between the IDF and the Hamas tunnels underneath. There is therefore an argument that this is a complex human shielding operation with the civilian population serving as a shield and the tunnels serving as primarily a protective device for Hamas. This is a rendering from the New York Times with extensive military operations, Hamas operations underneath those tunnels, sufficiently deep underneath those tunnels that ordinary bombardments, ordinary weight bombardments could not penetrate. Therefore, the level of artillery needed to penetrate down to the tunnels is extensive, thus exposing the civilian population above to enormous levels of injury and destruction. Now, if you believe that this setup was done intentionally in order for Hamas to protect itself and to use the civilian population as a layer of safeguard, then you would see that layer as a human shielding operation. What are other possible interpretations of human shielding? Well, when individuals who are not, for example, entitled to press protection put on a vest that says press, they are using the entitlement of the press, though that is mostly by customary international law, but still the entitlement and immunity of press agents to protect themselves from targeting by the other side, thus endangering the press all over the world in armed conflict. You could interpret that as a shielding operation. How is that interpreted in the larger information environment? That's interpreted all over the world as the IDF is targeting journalists, right? That's the difficulty of this situation, if indeed you believe that that is what is going on in the conflict. Okay. These are some images of what was discovered in the tunnels. I understand, once again, this is contentious, with weapons caches, room for holding hostages, tunnels running directly under civilian infrastructure. One question that one might have is, if the IDF is targeting members of Hamas in underground tunnels, is it in fact targeting the civilians who are above the ground on top of those tunnels? Right? So that is a question, and I heard Janina talking about primary and secondary targets. That is a question about how you interpret the concept of a target, right? That is the conundrum of human shielding, of course, if you interpret the situation through that lens. If your targeting of the enemy has to pass through a civilian, are you in fact targeting that civilian? Because we don't have a clear understanding of how human shielding works and how we should interpret the concept of targeting in a human shielding situation, the information environment in which this typical reporting is done, and indeed military analysts on this subject who are not clear on this matter either, do not know how to interpret this situation. The one way to understand it is that, no, of course, the civilians are not the target here. It is Hamas that is the target. But it is impossible to target Hamas in many, many situations without passing through the civilian population. So how to understand the application of targeting analysis and then proportionality under such circumstances. If we don't interpret the IDF as targeting civilians under those circumstances, how do we analyze what kind of injury to civilians is acceptable when there is a direct impact on civilians because members of Hamas are underneath? And what happens if there is literally no place the IDF can strike Hamas without, that should say civilians, without passing through civilians? Okay. Now, to make this matter more complex, there are at least two kinds of human shields, voluntary and involuntary human shields. Voluntary human shields are individuals who have intentionally placed themselves between a military target and military forces in an attempt to protect the military target from attack. And involuntary human shields are individuals that have been placed between a military target and military forces on the part of a third party in an attempt to protect the military target from attack. Okay. So how should we understand the difference between voluntary and involuntary human shields? Okay. So voluntary human shields are not, in fact, protected at all because they are participating in hostilities. So if I call this a principle of distinction scale, with on one side combatants who are legitimate targets and traditional combatants such that they wear uniforms openly, they carry their arms openly, they are members of a state military in international armed conflict. In asymmetric conflict, of course, as the United States identifies asymmetric conflict and violent non-state actor groups, we think of such groups as unlawful combatants. We identify them according to a status designation. But there is then this intermediate category of civilians directly participating in hostilities, and of course, voluntary human shields would fit into that category. So we would think of civilians directly participating in hostilities as voluntary human shields. However, involuntary human shields are civilians who have been placed there and are entitled to the full weight of protection. Now, how do we distinguish between voluntary and involuntary human shields? It's almost impossible to do. And that is the problem that obtains in, even if we get the analysis right, even if we understand how to deal with the problem of human shielding, it is extremely difficult to figure out when civilians are DPHing and when they are being placed involuntarily into a conflict in order to shield the enemy. Okay. I wrote about this in a piece for Haaretz in the situation when the IDF was poised to go into Rafah and the dilemma that it faced and the controversy surrounding that. In that piece I wrote, here is the core question. When proportionality is at risk, a country must seek to minimize civilian casualties in any way that is feasible, compatible with progressing towards its military goals. But how can the IDF minimize harm to Palestinian civilians when Hamas is trying to maximize the same harm? This was my view of the conflict at the time. And under such circumstances, what is the extent of Israel's responsibility for minimizing harm to civilians when those civilians have been put in harm's way by their own leaders? That, I think, creates a dilemma of profound proportions for the IDF. If you accept these premises, you may not, but if you do, I think it creates a profound dilemma that has not been sufficiently well analyzed. The practice of human shielding, therefore, creates an unacceptable and illegal catch-22 for any combatant trying to follow the laws of war. As I wrote further in that article, the practice of human shielding compromises the very concept of proportionality and threatens to undo the logic of IHL and the role played by the concept of national self-defense. Further, in a piece that I wrote with in Just Security with General Joe Votel, we wrote that genocide by human shielding should be a recognized offense and might plausibly be said to describe Hamas's tactic against the Palestinian people. We then wrote, quote, Hamas's leadership has revealed the organization's willingness to sacrifice multitudes of Palestinians for their cause, and we gave some examples of quotes that suggested a willingness to use the Palestinian people. There are many more to this end. The question then is, what is the obligation on the part of someone fighting an enemy like Hamas to safeguard the Palestinian people that they themselves will not safeguard? I should make clear, I don't think that this in any way reduces the obligation to engage in proper proportionality analysis, nor does it reduce the obligation to apply principles like the precautionary principle, and therefore to minimize harm below the level of proportionality to the extent that that is feasible and not incompatible with other military goals. I should also stress that I have been active in writing about the civilian harm mitigation program, which I think is a very important program for helping to analyze problems exactly like this. And one of the things that I've suggested is that we need a much more fine-grained analysis of how to attribute responsibility in cases of civilian harm in complex urban conflict of this sort, and that it is absolutely critical that we develop metrics. Those metrics are now required under the 2024 SHIELDS Act. A report is required to be submitted to the Secretary of Defense, and that report is now overdue. The Civilian Harm Mitigation Program would be an excellent partner in writing that report. It is my understanding that it has now been commissioned by the Center for Naval Analysis, so it will be written. But it is a mistake, in my view, to eliminate portions of our Department of Defense that can help us with this kind of analysis. It is an aid to combatant commanders. It is an aid to analysts everywhere. It is an aid to the information environment that has been profoundly unclear on the nature of the Gaza conflict, as it has been in the nature of many other conflicts, and it is critical that we get this right. So thank you very much.
We now have Michael Walzer joining us, and I see we've done that successfully. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Walzer, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thanks, Ed. And, I'm grateful for this invitation. I wish I could be with you in person. I'm also very glad to be speaking after Claire, who has provided an excellent analysis of the legal issues, which are really also very close to the moral issues. I'm also grateful to Claire for focusing on the tunnel. I want to begin there. The tunnels are really not quite tunnels. They are military city under and shielded by the civilian. And I emphasize that word city. There are roads that you can drive a truck on. There are shops for manufacturing weapons. There are storerooms for keeping weapons ready for use. There are dormitories for fighters, apparently for thousands of fighters. There are apartments for leaders. There are communication centers. And most amazing to me, there is considerable capacity for ventilation, fresh air flowing through 400 miles of tunnels. Now, this is, I have looked through what I can look through of military history. I don't believe there has ever been a war fought against an underground city. In Vietnam, the Viet Cong used tunnels. These were very primitive tunnels without any mechanical ventilation. The American tunnel rats that went down into the tunnels had to be very small and very skinny. I'll come back to them in a moment. There may be examples from ancient history of insurgent groups who fought from caves and who built tunnels connecting the caves. But in modern times, this is unprecedented. And it raises the question, if you face a city above that is a massive shield for a city below, what can you do? And Claire described some of the possibilities. Bombing the city below causes frightening, terrible damage to the city above. And if you want to minimize that damage, you've got to enter the tunnels. And doing that, even behind robots and dogs, is extremely dangerous. The survival rate among the American tunnel rats in Vietnam was not high. And that's something we need to think about. It is one of the major issues that I want to raise, so that tunnels, the city below poses a question that is a general question. It seems to me to be the crucial question, moral question about fighting against fighters who use human shields. And the question is, what risks can we ask our soldiers, the French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam or Afghanistan, the Israelis in Gaza, what can we ask those soldiers? What risks can we ask them to take in order to minimize the risks they impose on civilians being used by the enemy? And one standard response to that is no risks beyond those of the military mission itself. One answer to the question is that our soldiers and their civilians are of equal value. So there's no reason to ask our soldiers to take additional risks in order to minimize casualties to civilians. Let me look back to a Vietnam example that I used in Just and Unjust Wars. U.S. soldier, American soldiers take fire from Viet Cong fighters who are hiding in and shooting from an inhabited peasant village. Now, if assume that they don't just pull back and call in an air raid, which would be likely to cause disproportionate damage. Assume they just fire back, aiming as carefully as they can at the people firing at them. They aim as carefully as they can. And then I argued in the book, the blame for civilian deaths falls on the Viet Cong. And in a situation like this, on the ground, proportionality calculations are not going to be possible. The soldiers aiming as best they can are not going to know how many civilians are at risk, and they are not going to know how many civilians they are killing. The blame falls on the Viet Cong. Morally. But in those situations, and Claire talked about this, politically, the blame falls on the soldiers who were doing the killing. An American colonel in Afghanistan, sometime around 2010, described the dilemma this way: the more civilians we kill, the more certain it is that we will lose the war. The more civilians we kill, the more certain it is we will lose the war. And that's because these kinds of wars are political as well as military conflicts. And so, answering the question, how do you fight these wars? Maybe the soldiers in my Vietnam example have to try to get closer, have to try to find a position from which they can aim more accurately, minimizing civilian deaths and accepting some risk for themselves that they needn't have accepted in my previous description. So the general rule: fighters using civilian cover are responsible for civilian deaths, even if it's the other side that does the killing. But that can't be the whole story. What is the other side doing? Is it just firing back? Is it aiming carefully? Is it looking for better positions from which to fire back? Is it taking risks? over the years, since my book came out, I've talked to many officers at the military academies, and most of them, not all of them, most of them say that some risk is morally necessary. And I think for them, it's also a matter of professional honor. Armed, trained soldiers should protect unarmed, helpless, untrained, vulnerable civilians, even enemy civilians, and even civilians who are sympathetic to the cause of the enemy, because we should assume that even if they are ideologically sympathetic, even then, we can be pretty sure that they don't want their families to be used as human shields. So, some risk. Some risk. How much? Moral philosophy doesn't have much to say about that. Certainly, my moral philosophy doesn't. Everything depends on the junior officer on the ground who has been or who should have been trained for moments like this. The officer who knows the immediate situation, who knows the soldiers, who knows what he or she can ask of them. So I can't sit on an American campus and tell that officer what to do. I want to close with a story parallel to the one I gave from Vietnam. And it's an Afghan story that an officer, I think one of the officers who had helped design McChrystal's new rules of engagement from 2010 or 11, I was at the Army War College and he told me this story. American soldiers take fire from the roof of a small apartment building in an Afghan village or town. They don't know who's in the building. They only know there are Taliban fighters on the roof. What should they do? And the officer said to me, in the old days, before McChrystal's rules of engagement, we would just pull back and call in the artillery or an airstrike. Now we can't do that. So what should we do? Well, you could send scouts into the building with protective fire, and then we would find out if there were families in the building. And if the building was completely empty, maybe we could call in an artillery strike. Or we could try to get soldiers onto some nearby roof where they can fire directly at the Taliban at the Taliban fighters. Both of these possibilities involve asking soldiers to take risks that they would obviously not have to take if you just called in an airstrike. So, can we ask soldiers to take those kinds of risks? And what the officer said to me is the 24-year-old or 25, 26-year-old on the ground, the officer there has to make that decision. And if he thinks the risks are too great to send scouts or to get people on adjoining roofs, then he has to withdraw, which is something that American soldiers are not supposed to do, leaving the battlefield. But that's what he should do in that case. He should withdraw. There will be other occasions. This is what the officer said. There will be other occasions to get the bad guys on the roof. He must withdraw because of the possibility of innocent civilians in the building. And all that sounds right to me. And I am not going to second guess the guy on the ground, but I do think, and this is the way I think Clara ended, I do think it is very important that just this question, what can we ask of our soldiers, has to be debated, argued, discussed, talked about, not only in the armed forces, but also among the citizens of democratic states which are ready to send their young men and women into situations of that sort. We have an obligation to address that question, to address the question of, okay, some risk, morally necessary, politically smart, some risk, but how much? How much? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Claire has a few words she'd like to say, and then we're going to open it up for